Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where sleepless nights and old mountains meet. Tonight's journey takes us into the Appalachian Mountains, a place older than memory, where the soil itself seems to remember every scream, every prayer. These aren't urban legends built for clicks. They're first-hand experiences, twisted folklore, and events so vivid they refuse to fade. While you still can, subscribe and turn on the bell so you're never left alone with just the echoes. Draw your chair close. Our first story is moving toward us even now, like footsteps on fallen leaves. Story 1. Last broadcast, the radio in my cabin picked up WPVM, this final broadcast at 3:17 a.m. And I heard DJ Tommy Kendrick die live on the air 47 years after the station supposedly went dark forever. Now that same broadcast plays every night, and it is getting clearer each time. My name is Jack Sullivan, and I am a retired telephone lineman from Pittsburgh. I bought a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia 3 years ago, looking for peace and quiet after 4 decades of climbing poles and fixing lines in all kinds of weather. What I found instead was a mystery that was slowly driving me insane. WPVM 102.7 FM was a small-time radio station that served the remote hollows around Pineville from 1968 to 1975. The station broadcast from a converted farmhouse on Copper Ridge, playing country music and local news for the scattered mountain communities that couldn't pick up anything else through the interference of the peaks and valleys. The station's final broadcast happened during the blizzard of March 15, 1975. According to the official records, DJ Tommy Kendrick was working the overnight shift alone when the storm knocked out power lines across 3 counties. The station went dark at 11:43 p.m., and Kendrick's body was found 3 days later when the roads cleared enough for emergency crews to reach the isolated building. The coroner ruled it accidental death from hypothermia. Kendrick had apparently tried to keep the station running on backup generators, but the cold had gotten to him when the fuel ran out. They found him at his broadcast desk, headphones still on, frozen solid with his hand reaching toward the microphone. But that is not the whole story. That is not what really happened during those final hours at WPVM. And I know because I've heard the truth every night for the past 6 months. My cabin sits about 8 miles from the old station site, in a valley where radio reception has always been spotty. Most nights, my little kitchen radio picks up nothing but static from the Pittsburgh stations fighting their way through the mountains. But sometimes, usually in the early morning hours, it locks onto 102.7 FM and plays something that shouldn't exist. The first time it happened, I thought I was dreaming. I'd fallen asleep in my recliner watching late-night TV when the sound of country music drifted in from the kitchen. Not modern country, but the old stuff from the 70s. Hank Williams Jr., Waylon Jennings, Conway Twitty. The kind of music they don't play on commercial radio anymore. When I checked the radio, the display showed 102.7 FM, but that frequency had been dead for decades. I figured it was some kind of atmospheric skip, a distant station bouncing signals off the ionosphere. It happens sometimes in the mountains, especially during certain weather conditions. Then I heard Tommy Kendrick, his voice. He sounded exactly like he did in the old recordings I found online. Young, enthusiastic, with the slight mountain accent that marked him as local. He was doing the regular DJ patter, giving the time and temperature, mentioning local events that had happened 47 years ago. But something was wrong with his delivery. There was an edge to his voice, a tension that grew more pronounced as I listened. He kept mentioning the storm outside, how the wind was getting stronger, how the power lines were swaying in ways that made him nervous. Then he started talking about something else, something that shouldn't have been there. Kendrick mentioned hearing footsteps on the station, his front porch, slow and deliberate despite the howling wind. He laughed it off at first, making jokes about late-night visitors and storm refugees. But the footsteps kept coming back, circling the building, stopping at windows that were too high off the ground for any normal person to reach. That's when the broadcast became something different, something terrible. I listened in growing horror as Kendrick described shapes moving outside the windows, figures that didn't quite look human in the intermittent lightning flashes. His voice changed from nervous to frightened to absolutely terrified as whatever was out there began testing the doors and windows, looking for a way inside. The broadcast continued for exactly 43 minutes. I know because I timed it every night afterward, compulsively checking my watch as the same events played out in the same order. 43 minutes of mounting terror as something inhuman stalked a lonely DJ during the worst blizzard in decades. The worst part was hearing the moment when they got inside. Kendrick's voice rose to a near scream as he described the front door opening despite being locked and barricaded. He begged anyone listening to send help, to call the police, to do something as the things came up the stairs toward the broadcast booth. But there was no one to hear him. The storm had knocked out phone lines, and his was likely the only radio signal getting through the atmospheric chaos. The broadcast ended with sounds I can adequately describe. Not quite human voices, but not animal either. Something that might once have been words, distorted beyond recognition but still carrying unmistakable menace. Then static, and silence, and the normal emptiness of 102.7 FM. I researched everything I could find about WPVM and its final night. The official story was clean and simple. Equipment failure during a storm, unfortunate accident, case closed. But I found inconsistencies that gnawed at me like a broken tooth. The backup generators had full fuel tanks when they found Kendrick's body. The building showed no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or damaged doors. Most puzzling of all, the station's transmitter was still warm when rescue crews arrived, suggesting it had been broadcasting right up until they cut the power. But if Kendrick had died from hypothermia hours earlier, who had been running the equipment? I started visiting the old station site during daylight hours, hiking up the overgrown logging road to see what remained of WPVM. The building was still there, though barely. 47 years of mountain weather had reduced it to a collapsing shell, windows broken, roof caved in, walls covered with kudzu and poison ivy. But the broadcast equipment was still intact. Not functional, obviously. Decades of exposure had reduced the electronics to rusted scrap. But the basic layout remained. The mixing board, the turntables, the microphone stand where Tommy Kendrick had made his final broadcast. Everything was exactly where it had been on that March night in 1975. Including the headphones. They hung from a hook beside the microphone. Their foam ear pads rotted away, but the basic structure still recognizable. When I touched them, they were warm. That night, the broadcast came through clearer than ever. Every word was distinct, every sound effect sharp and immediate. I could hear the wind rattling the station's windows, the creak of old floorboards under unknown feet, the desperate rasp of Kendrick, just breathing as his situation became hopeless. But I also heard something new. In the background, barely audible beneath the DJ's terrified narration, was another sound. A low, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the broadcast booth itself. The tapping followed a pattern that took me several nights to recognize. It was Morse code, crude and hesitant, as if tapped out by someone who barely remembered the basics, but definitely Morse code. The message was simple and horrible, still here. I bought a Morse code app for my phone and started translating the background signals I heard during each broadcast. Most were just random letters, meaningless repetitions of the alphabet. But sometimes, coherent messages came through. Cold, so cold, can, to leave. They won. Then let me go. Help me. I realized with growing horror that Tommy Kendrick was still in that ruined station, still trying to broadcast, still trapped in those final 43 minutes of terror from March 15, 1975. Something had prevented him from dying properly, from finding the peace that should come with death. The things that had broken into WPVM that night weren't to finish with him. I started bringing equipment up to the station site, a portable radio, fresh batteries, even a small generator to power a digital recorder. I wanted to document what was happening, to prove that the broadcasts were real and not just the product of an aging man, his isolation and imagination. That is when I made the mistake that changed everything. I tried to respond. Using an old CB radio, I transmitted on 102.7 FM during one of Kendrick's broadcasts. I told him I could hear him, that I was trying to help, that he needed to break free from whatever was keeping him trapped in that endless loop of terror. The broadcast stopped immediately. For the first time in months, 102.7 went completely silent. Then, slowly, Tommy Kendrick's voice came back. But it was different now. Older, wearier, filled with a despair that was almost tangible through the radio speakers. He thanked me for listening. Said he'd been alone for so long, replaying that night over and over, that he'd almost forgotten other people existed. But then his voice changed, became urgent and frightened. He told me I made a terrible mistake by responding. The things that had come for him that night were still there, still waiting, and now they knew about me. By making contact, I'd given them a new focus, a fresh target for their attention. The broadcast ended with a warning that made my blood freeze. Tommy Kendrick, or whatever was left of him, told me to leave the mountains immediately, to pack up my cabin and get as far away as possible before they found me. Because they were already looking. That was 3 days ago. Since then, I heard them every night. Footsteps on my porch, shapes moving past windows, the same sounds that had terrorized Kendrick during his final broadcast. My radio picks up 102.7 constantly now, no longer limited to the early morning hours. And the broadcasts are changing. Instead of just replaying that night in 1975, they reincorporating new elements. References to my cabin, descriptions of my daily routines, warnings about what is coming for me. Last night, I heard Tommy Kendrick describe watching them surround my cabin, the same inhuman figures that had stalked him decades ago. He begged me to run, to escape before they found a way inside, but I know it was too late. I can hear them now, testing my doors and windows, circling the building in patterns that make no sense. My radio has been locked onto 102.7 for 6 straight hours, and Tommy's voice is getting weaker, more distant, as if he is being pulled away from the microphone. But new voices are joining the broadcast, clearer voices, stronger ones, coming from right outside my cabin. They talking about breaking in, about adding me to their collection, about the decades of loneliness that await anyone foolish enough to interfere with their business. I am transmitting this message on all frequencies, hoping someone will hear it and stay away from these mountains. The broadcast from WPVM 102.7 is real, but it is not just a recording or atmospheric phenomenon. It's a trap, a lure designed to draw curious people into the same hell that claimed Tommy Kendrick. If you ever pick up that signal, if you hear a frightened DJ describing something breaking into his station, Don, to respond. Don, to try to help. Don, to make the same mistake I did. Just change the station and forget you ever heard it. Because some broadcasts should never find an audience, and some DJs should never get requests from the living. Story 2. Plague Village of Hot Springs. The coughing started at midnight, and I knew I was hearing the sound of people who died 150 years ago. My name is Mike Garrison, and I am a wildlife photographer from Virginia. Last month, I was camping in the remote mountains of North Carolina, following reports of a rare owl species that hadn't been photographed in decades. What I found instead was the ruins of a town that was supposed to have been completely destroyed in 1847, and sounds that still echo from graves that were never properly dug. I spent most of my adult life in the wilderness. 23 years documenting animals that most people never see, hiking trails that dawn to appear on any map, sleeping under stars in places where cell phones dawn to work and the nearest human being might be 50 miles away. I thought I'd seen everything the Appalachian Mountains had to offer. I was wrong. The ranger at the Cherokee National Forest Station had mentioned the ruins almost as an afterthought when I asked about remote camping locations. Just some old foundations up on Bald Mountain Ridge, he said. Nothing interesting, just stones and weeds where a logging camp used to be. But something about the way he avoided eye contact when he said it made me curious. The hike to the ridge took most of the day. No marked trail, just game paths and creek beds that led steadily upward through dense forest. My GPS showed nothing but green wilderness for miles in every direction, which was exactly what I wanted. The kind of isolation where rare birds feel safe enough to show themselves. But as I climbed higher, I started noticing things that didn't belong in a natural forest. Perfectly straight lines of trees that were all the same age, growing where fence lines used to run. Slight depressions in the ground that formed rectangles too regular to be natural. And everywhere, scattered stones that had clearly been worked by human hands. This hadn't been a logging camp. This had been a town. I made camp in a clearing near what looked like it might have been a main street once upon a time. Stone foundations poked through the undergrowth every 50 feet or so, outlining buildings that had vanished long ago. At the center of the ruins, a single chimney rose from a foundation larger than the rest, probably what had been the town's store or meeting hall. As I set up my tent, I kept finding more evidence of the community that had existed here. Fragments of pottery buried in the leaf litter, pieces of rusted metal that might have been tools or household items, and carved into trees that had grown around them, wooden grave markers so weathered I could barely make out the dates. 1847. All of them from the same year. The first night passed quietly enough. I woke up a few times thinking I heard voices in the distance, but sound carries strangely in mountain valleys. Probably just the wind moving through the trees, or maybe other campers somewhere farther down the ridge. It was the second night when things started going wrong. I was reviewing the photos I'd taken that day on my camera SLCD screen when I noticed something in the background of several shots. In pictures of the ruins, where I had been photographing the stone foundations, there were shapes that shouldn't have been there. Tall, thin figures standing among the trees, barely visible in the shadows between the trunks. But when I'd been taking the photos, I hadn't seen anyone. I scrolled through more images, and the figures appeared in almost every shot. Always at the edge of the frame, always in shadow, but definitely human-shaped. Men, women, children, all standing perfectly still among the ruins of what had once been their town. That's when I heard the first cough. It came from somewhere beyond the large foundation at the center of the ruins. A wet, rattling sound that went on for almost 30 seconds before dissolving into a wheezing gasp. Then another cough answered it from a different direction. Then another. Within minutes, the entire valley was filled with the sound of people coughing, choking, struggling to breathe. But I was alone on that mountain. The nearest road was 15 miles away, and I hadn't seen another human being in 2 days. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the ruins. Nothing, just empty stone foundations and overgrown weeds swaying in the night breeze. But the coughing continued, getting louder and more desperate. I could hear voices now too, weak and distant, calling out words I couldn't understand. Then I saw them, pale figures moving between the ruins, barely visible in the moonlight filtering through the trees. They walked with the slow, unsteady gait of people who were very sick, stopping every few steps to double over with coughing fits that seemed to tear their bodies apart. Men in the simple clothes of 19th century farmers. Women in long dresses that dragged behind them as they stumbled through the weeds. Children who moved like old people, bent and broken by whatever illness had consumed this place. I should have packed up my gear and hiked out of there immediately. But something kept me frozen in place, watching as the ghostly residents of this dead town went about their nightly routine. They moved through the ruins like they were still navigating streets and buildings that had been gone for more than a century. A woman stopped at what must have been her front door, fumbling with keys that weren't there to unlock a house that no longer existed. A man sat heavily on steps that were now just scattered stones, holding his head in his hands as his body shook with violent coughing. The sounds they made were the worst part. Not just the coughing, but the whimpering and moaning that comes with serious illness. The sound of people dying slowly, in agony, with no hope of recovery. And underneath it all, a constant whisper of voices calling out names, looking for family members who might still be alive somewhere in the darkness. I retreated to my tent and zipped myself inside, but the canvas walls couldn't block out the sounds of the plague village, this nightly resurrection. The coughing went on until dawn, accompanied by footsteps that circled my campsite but never came close enough for me to see who was making them. When the sun came up, the ruins were empty and silent again. But scattered around my tent, pressed into the soft earth, were dozens of bare footprints. Men, as boots, women, as shoes, children, as small feet. All leading to and from the foundations where houses had once stood. I should have left then. Should have hiked back to my truck and driven straight home to Virginia. Instead, I spent the day exploring the ruins more thoroughly, trying to understand what had happened to this place. And in the foundation of what must have been the largest building, I found a metal box buried under decades of fallen leaves. The box was old but intact, protected from the weather by its location under the stone foundation. Inside were documents, records from the town that had existed here. Official papers from something called Hot Springs Settlement, dated 1845 to 1847. Birth certificates, death certificates, and most disturbing of all, a doctor's journal chronicling the final months of the community. According to the journal, Hot Springs Settlement had been founded by families seeking to escape the cholera outbreaks that were sweeping through larger cities in the 1840s. They'd chosen this remote location specifically because of its isolation, believing they could wait out the epidemic in the clean mountain air. But they brought the sickness with them. The first cases appeared in the spring of 1847. Within months, It had spread through the entire community. The doctor's handwriting grew increasingly erratic as he documented the progression of the disease. High fever, violent coughing, blood in the lungs, and something else, something that didn't match any known illness of the time. The sick claimed to see people who had already died. They spoke to empty air, reached out to touch faces that weren't there. In his final entries, the doctor wondered if the disease was affecting their minds as well as their bodies, or if something about this particular place made the boundary between life and death thin enough to cross. The last entry was dated November 15, 1847. The doctor wrote that he was the only resident still alive, and that he could hear the voices of the dead calling to him from every house in the settlement. He debarricaded himself in the meeting hall, but the doors were starting to give way. Not to living intruders, but to something else entirely. State records from the time confirmed what the doctor had feared. When officials finally reached Hot Springs Settlement in the spring of 1848, they found every building burned to the ground and no survivors. The entire community had been wiped out. The area was declared a quarantine zone and left to grow wild. But according to the documents I found, the burning hadn't been done by the state. The last residents had done it themselves, in a desperate attempt to stop whatever was spreading through their town from reaching the outside world. That second night, I understood why they'd been so desperate. The coughing started earlier, just after sunset. But this time, it was different, closer, and mixed in with the sounds of illness were other noises that made my blood turn to ice water. The creak of rope, the thud of shovels hitting earth, the whispered prayers of people preparing for death. They weren't just reliving their final days anymore. They were reliving their final hours. I watched from my tent as the ghostly residents of Hot Springs Settlement gathered around what must have been the town well. They moved in a procession, carrying something between them that I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. But I could hear the soft thump of bodies being lowered into the ground, and the scrape of dirt being thrown on top of them. They were burying their dead, over and over, night after night, replaying the desperate final act of a community that knew it was doomed. But the worst realization came when I saw who was leading the procession. It was the doctor from the journal, still alive in this ghostly replay, still trying to maintain some semblance of order as his world collapsed around him. And when he turned to look directly at my tent, I saw his face clearly for the first time. He looked exactly like me. Same features, same build, same expression of horror and disbelief. Like I was looking into a mirror that reflected not just my appearance, but my future. And in that moment, I understood why I'd been drawn to this place, why the ranger had avoided my eyes when he mentioned the ruins, why my camera had captured figures I hadn't seen with my naked eye. Hot Springs Settlement hadn't been completely destroyed. Some part of it still existed, trapped in an endless loop of death and burial, waiting for someone to complete the cycle. Waiting for the last doctor to finally succumb to the plague that had claimed everyone else. I felt the first tickle in my throat as the ghostly procession approached my tent. By morning, the cough had started. Dry at first, then wet and rattling, just like the sounds I'd been hearing from the ruins for the past 2 nights. I packed my gear and started the hike back to civilization. But with every step, the cough got worse. The drive to the nearest hospital took 4 hours. By the time I arrived, I was coughing up blood, and the doctors couldn't identify what was wrong with me. They ran test after test, but nothing showed up on their instruments. According to modern medicine, I was perfectly healthy. But I knew better. I could feel the illness spreading through my body, just like it had spread through Hot Springs Settlement in 1847. And every night when I try to sleep, I can hear the voices of the plague village calling to me from the mountains of North Carolina. They were waiting for me to come back, waiting for the last doctor to join their eternal procession, so the cycle can finally be complete. And with each passing day, the urge to return gets stronger. I am writing this as a warning. Dawn, to go looking for the ruins on Bald Mountain Ridge. Dawn, to trust rangers who won, to meet your eyes when they mention old foundations in the wilderness. And if you recamping alone in the North Carolina mountains and you hear coughing in the darkness, break camp immediately and get as far away as possible. Some towns never really die. They just wait for the right person to bring them back to life. The coughing is getting worse now, and I can feel something calling me back to those ruins, back to complete what started over a century ago. I think I'm going to drive back to North Carolina tomorrow, just to take one more look at those foundations, just to make sure the plague village is really gone, just to finish what the last doctor couldn't. Story 3. Doorway. I stepped through that ornate doorframe bolted to the rock face in the West Virginia mountains. And for exactly 7 seconds, I saw what our world becomes after everything dies. Now I can stop seeing it everywhere I look. My name is Carl Henderson, and I am a retired mine foreman from Charleston. I've spent 40 years underground in the coal mines, seen cave-ins and gas explosions, watched good men die in the darkness beneath the mountains. I thought I knew what fear looked like until I found the doorway to nowhere and learned that some portals should never be opened. The doorframe sits on Crow Mountain, about 15 miles northeast of Beckley, in a part of the Appalachians where the old maps still show blank spaces. It is an impossible thing, 8 feet tall, carved from black walnut that looks fresh despite decades of mountain weather, with brass hinges that gleam like they were polished yesterday. The frame is bolted directly into the living rock with iron spikes thick as railroad ties. But there is no door. Never has been. Just an empty rectangle that shows the forest behind it. The same view you'd see if you walked around to the other side. Except when you step through it, then you see something else entirely. Local legend says the doorway was built in 1962 by a man named Ezekiel Thorne, a wealthy eccentric from Philadelphia who inherited coal money and lost his mind to grief. His wife and 3 children had died in a house fire, and Thorne became obsessed with finding a way to reach them in whatever came after death. He studied every occult text he could find, corresponded with mystics and frauds across the globe, spent a fortune on rituals and ceremonies that promised to open doorways between worlds. Nothing worked until he came to the mountains. Following old Cherokee stories about thin places where the spirits crossed over, Thorne hired local craftsmen to build his portal on Crow Mountain, choosing the spot because it sat on what the Cherokee called a wound in the earth, a place where the boundary between worlds had been damaged by some ancient trauma. He carved protective symbols into the frame, symbols that hurt to look at directly, and performed ceremonies that made the mountain animals flee for miles in every direction. The doorway was completed on Halloween night, 1962. Thorne stepped through it at the stroke of midnight, and according to the Cherokee medicine man who witnessed the event, he returned 7 seconds later screaming about gray worlds and dead suns. They found him the next morning, sitting at the base of the mountain, catatonic and unable to speak. Thorne spent the last 23 years of his life in a mental institution in Huntington, drawing the same image over and over on every scrap of paper he could find. A landscape of ash-colored hills under a sky the color of old bone, with a black sun that gave no light hanging motionless overhead. I first heard about the doorway from my grandfather, who worked as a logger on Crow Mountain in the 60s. He said Thorne's workers had quit halfway through the project, claiming the forest went silent whenever they tried to work. Birds stopped singing, insects disappeared, even the wind died when they got too close to the rock face where the portal would stand. But the old Cherokee stories were what really caught my attention. They spoke of broken places where the dead world leaked through, contaminating everything it touched. They said these wounds in reality were created by great tragedies, moments of such intense suffering that they tore holes in the fabric between what is and what should never be. I retired from the mines the previous spring, and like most men my age with too much time and not enough sense, I decided to see if the legend was true. I drove up Crow Mountain on a gray October morning, following logging roads that hadn't been maintained since the 80s. The doorway stood exactly where my grandfather had described it, in a clearing surrounded by dead trees. Not dying trees, not diseased trees, but trees that looked like they had been drained of life itself. The bark was gray, the branches brittle as old bones, and not a single leaf remained on any of them. But the doorframe itself looked perfect. The black walnut gleamed with natural oils, the brass hinges moved smoothly on their pins, and the carved symbols seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a work of craftsmanship that belonged in a museum but felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. I walked around the frame several times, studying it from every angle. From the back, I could see straight through to the forest beyond, just like looking through any empty doorframe. But something felt different when I stood in front of it, as if the air itself was thicker, more resistant to movement. The symbols carved into the frame made my eyes water when I tried to focus on them. They weren't from any language I recognized, but they suggested meanings that my brain couldn't quite grasp. Protection, maybe, or warning, or invitation. The longer I stared, the more they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. That's when I noticed the footprints. They led from the forest edge to the doorframe and back again, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Boot prints, sneaker treads, bare feet of all sizes. Most were old, filled with fallen leaves and worn smooth by weather. But some looked fresh, as if other people had visited recently. What unsettled me most was that all the footprints approached the doorway from the front, but the return tracks wandered randomly, as if the people making them had been stumbling, disoriented, unable to walk in straight lines. I should have heeded that warning. Should have gotten back in my truck and driven home to my comfortable retirement. Instead, I stepped closer to the frame, drawn by curiosity that overrode every instinct for self-preservation. The air in front of the doorway felt electric, like the moments before a thunderstorm when every hair on your body stands on end. My compass spun wildly when I held it near the frame, and my cell phone screen flickered with static that formed patterns almost like writing. I reached out and touched the frame itself. The wood was warm, almost fever hot, and it seemed to pulse with a slow, steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The brass hinges hummed with a frequency I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. Through the empty doorframe, I could still see the dead forest behind it. But now there were subtle differences in the view. The shadows fell wrong, pointing in directions that didn't to match the position of the sun. The dead trees seemed to lean at impossible angles, and the ground looked farther away than it should have. I knew I shouldn't do it. Every rational part of my brain screamed warnings about unstable ground and optical illusions. But something deeper, some primal need to explore and understand, compelled me forward. I stepped through the doorway. For a moment, nothing happened. I stood in the same forest, surrounded by the same dead trees, breathing the same mountain air. Then reality shifted, like looking through water that suddenly cleared, and I saw where I really was. The landscape beyond the doorway was the same, but wrong. The mountains had the same shape, the same ridgelines and valleys, but everything was the color of ash. The trees were black skeletons against a sky the color of old bone, and the sun, if that dark orb overhead could be called a sun, gave no warmth, no real light, just enough illumination to reveal the desolation. This was our world, but dead, not destroyed by war or disaster, but simply drained of life itself. The air tasted of dust and emptiness, and when I tried to take a breath, my lungs found no nourishment in it. I could see the doorframe behind me, glowing with the only real light in this gray wasteland. It stood in the exact same spot, bolted to rock that was now the color of charcoal, offering the only escape from this place where nothing had ever lived or ever would live. But I wasn't alone in the dead world. Movement caught my eye in the distance, figures walking slowly across the ash-colored hills. They were too far away to see clearly, but their movements were wrong, too stiff and mechanical to be human. As I watched, more figures appeared, all walking in the same direction, all moving with that same unnatural gait. They were walking toward the doorway, toward me. I tried to step back through the portal, but my feet wouldn't move. The ground beneath me had changed, becoming soft and yielding like wet sand. I was sinking into it, slowly but steadily, while the gray figures drew closer across the lifeless landscape. Panic gave me strength. I threw myself backward, fighting against the pull of the dead earth, reaching desperately for the glowing rectangle that promised escape. My fingers touched the doorframe, felt the warm wood and humming brass, and suddenly I was back in the West Virginia forest, gasping and shaking and more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. But I brought something back with me. The dead world clung to my clothes like smoke, a smell of dust and emptiness that no amount of washing could remove. My eyes had been changed by what I'd seen, sensitized to glimpses of that gray realm that overlapped our own. Now I see it everywhere. In mirrors, for just a moment before my reflection appears. In windows at night, showing ash-colored rooms instead of the familiar spaces beyond. In puddles after rain, reflecting that bone-white sky instead of clouds. The worst part is the figures. I see them in my peripheral vision. Gray shapes moving through our world like ghosts. The same ones I saw walking across that dead landscape. And I know they followed me back through the doorway. They here now, in our reality, spreading their emptiness like an infection. I tried to research what I experienced, looking for similar accounts or scientific explanations. What I found was worse than no answers at all. Ezekiel Thorne wasn't the first to build such a doorway. Throughout history, in cultures around the world, there are stories of portals to dead worlds, places where reality has worn thin enough for the void to leak through. The Cherokee called it the Gray Hunger, a spiritual contamination that devoured everything it touched, leaving only ash and emptiness behind. They said it came from places of great sorrow, feeding on grief and despair until it grew strong enough to cross over into our world. That is what Thorn had unleashed with his portal. In his grief over losing his family, he created a doorway for the Gray Hunger to enter our reality. Every person who stepped through that frame brought more contamination back with him, more emptiness that slowly spread through the world like cancer. I understand now why Thorn spent his final years drawing those images of the dead landscape. It wasn't the madness, it was warning. He was trying to document what was coming, what his doorway was gradually allowing to seep into our reality. The process is slow, almost imperceptible, but it is accelerating. I see it in the increasing number of dead trees on Crow Mountain, in the way birds avoid that part of the forest, in the strange weather patterns that seem to center around the doorway. The Gray Hunger is establishing a foothold in our world, and every person who passes through that portal makes it stronger. I've considered going back, trying to destroy the doorway somehow, but I know it's too late. The damage is done, the connection established. Even if I could tear down Thorn's frame, the wound in reality would remain, invisible but growing larger with each passing day. Besides, I don't think I could survive another crossing. The dead world has marked me, claimed part of me for its own. Sometimes, when I look in mirrors, I see myself standing in that ash-colored landscape, one of the gray figures walking endlessly across the lifeless hills. I am writing this as a warning, though I doubt many will believe it. If you ever find yourself hiking in the mountains of West Virginia, if you come across an ornate doorframe bolted to a rock face surrounded by dead trees, turn around and walk away. Don't let curiosity override your survival instincts the way I did. The doorway is real, and what lies beyond it is spreading into our world like a slow poison. Each person who steps through brings back a little more of that emptiness, that gray hunger that devours life itself. And if you do find the doorway, if you ignore this warning and step through anyway, remember one thing. You'll only have 7 seconds to see the truth before you have to choose between returning to our world or becoming part of the dead one forever. Choose quickly. The Gray Hunger is patient, but it is also very, very hungry. And it has been waiting so long for our world to be ready for consumption. Story 4. Graveyard worms. The glowing worms crawling out of my father. This fresh grave were not feeding on his body, and that made them infinitely more terrifying than any normal scavenger. I first saw them moving beneath the loose soil like living Christmas lights, their bioluminescent bodies pulsing with an eerie blue-green radiance that had nothing to do with natural decomposition. Each worm was the size of a garden snake, thick as a man, his thumb, and they moved with purpose that suggested intelligence far beyond what any earthworm should possess. My name is Daniel Mackenzie, and I had come to Spruce Flat, Tennessee, to bury my father in the remote mountain cemetery where 5 generations of our family lay beneath weathered headstones. The tiny community sits in a valley so isolated that cell phones don't work, and the nearest town is 40 miles of winding mountain roads that GPS systems refuse to map. Dad had insisted on being buried in Spruce Flat despite living his last 30 years in Nashville, claiming that our mountain roots ran too deep to be severed by modern convenience. He wanted to rest alongside his ancestors in soil that remembered when the Mackenzie family first carved homesteads from virgin wilderness over 2 centuries ago. But the cemetery held secrets that Dad had never shared with him, knowledge that died with him 3 days before I arrived to fulfill his final wishes. The locals watched my rental truck navigate the narrow road with expressions that mixed sympathy with something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. Old Pete Morrison, who ran the combination general store and funeral home, was reluctant to discuss the burial arrangements when I stopped to make final preparations. He kept glancing toward the cemetery that sat on a hillside visible through his front window, his weathered hands shaking slightly as he filled out the necessary paperwork. The graveyard worms were a local legend, Pete finally admitted, creatures that appeared only in Spruce Flat, his cemetery, and only after recent burials. Most folks claimed they were harmless, just another peculiarity of mountain life, like the mysterious lights that dance over certain hollows or the way compasses spun wildly in certain parts of the forest. But Pete his grandmother had told different stories, tales that suggested the glowing worms were attracted to more than just fresh graves. According to her, they fed on the memories and souls of the newly dead, consuming everything that made a person unique before the body had time to properly decay. I dismissed such stories as typical mountain folklore, the kind of superstitious nonsense that isolated communities developed to explain natural phenomena they don't understand. Bioluminescent organisms were not uncommon in damp environments, and Tennessee's limestone caves were full of creatures that glowed with various forms of chemically produced light. The funeral service was small and simple, attended only by myself and a handful of elderly residents who remembered Dad from his childhood in Spruce Flat. We laid him to rest in a plot next to my grandmother's grave, covering his casket with the dark mountain soil that had nourished our family for generations. But as the sun set behind the ridgeline and the other mourners departed for their homes, I noticed the first faint glimmers of light beginning to appear in the freshly turned earth above Dad's grave. At first I thought they were reflections from my truck's headlights, but the glow persisted even after I turned off the engine. The luminescent patches grew brighter as darkness settled over the cemetery, revealing themselves as segments of something alive moving beneath the loose soil. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and approached Dad's grave, expecting to find some variety of glowing fungus or phosphorescent bacteria. Instead, I discovered worms unlike anything I had ever seen in nature documentaries or biology textbooks. Each creature was easily 6 inches long and unnaturally thick, their translucent skin revealing internal organs that pulsed with blue-green light. But most disturbing was the way they moved, not with the random writhing of normal earthworms but with coordinated purpose that suggested group intelligence. The worms were working together to excavate precise tunnels through the disturbed soil, creating a network of passages that led directly toward Dad's casket 6 feet below the surface. Their bioluminescence allowed them to navigate in complete darkness, but I had the unsettling impression that light was not their primary means of sensing the environment around them. I should have left then, should have driven back to Nashville and trusted that whatever was happening in Spruce Flat, this cemetery was part of some natural process I did not understand. But morbid curiosity kept me watching as more worms emerged from the surrounding graves, all converging on the fresh burial site like moths drawn to flame. The creatures moved in waves, dozens becoming hundreds as they responded to some signal I could not detect. They flowed across the cemetery like a glowing river, their combined luminescence bright enough to read by, all focused on the single goal of reaching the body that lay buried beneath 6 feet of Tennessee clay. But they were not ordinary scavengers seeking decomposing flesh. Normal carrion feeders would have been attracted to any recent grave, but these creatures showed no interest in other burial sites, even those that were only days or weeks old. They wanted something specific from Dad's body, something that had nothing to do with physical sustenance. I began to understand the true horror of Pete Morrison, his grandmother, his stories as I watched the worms disappear into their precisely excavated tunnels. They were not feeding on Dad's corpse but on something far more precious, the accumulated memories and experiences that had made him uniquely himself. The glowing creatures were consuming his soul. I could feel it happening as their bioluminescent network spread beneath the cemetery, a gradual emptying of presence that made the night air feel thinner and colder. Dad's spirit was being systematically digested by organisms that had evolved to feed on the essence of human consciousness rather than mere flesh and bone. The process was not violent or dramatic but simply thorough, like watching a library being methodically emptied one book at a time. Everything that had made my father who he was, his memories of childhood in these mountains, his love for family, his accumulated wisdom and personality, was being absorbed by creatures that treated human consciousness as nothing more than another form of nourishment. I tried to dig down to the casket, using a shovel from my truck to excavate the loose soil that the worms had disturbed. But for every shovelful of dirt I removed, more glowing creatures emerged to take its place, their numbers seemingly inexhaustible as they poured from other graves throughout the cemetery. The realization hit me then that this had been happening for generations, that every person buried in Spruce Flat, his cemetery, had been subjected to the same spiritual consumption. The Mackenzie family plot was surrounded by empty shells, bodies that had been preserved by embalming but souls that had been completely devoured by creatures that existed primarily to feed on human consciousness. The worms began emerging from older graves as well, their bioluminescence revealing the true scope of the infestation that had claimed the cemetery. Hundreds of thousands of the creatures lived beneath the weathered headstones, creating a vast underground network that connected every burial site in the valley. But these older specimens were different from the ones feeding on Dad's fresh grave. Their bodies glowed with different colors, subtle variations in hue that seemed to correspond to the personalities they had consumed. Some pulsed with warm amber light that might once have belonged to someone with a gentle nature, while others flickered with cold blue radiance that suggested more analytical minds. I was witnessing the visible manifestation of every soul that had ever been buried in Spruce Flat. Their consciousness preserved not in any afterlife but in the digestive systems of creatures that had learned to metabolize human memory. The cemetery was not a place of rest but a feeding ground where death marked the beginning of a more complete form of consumption. The temperature around Dad's grave began to drop as the worms completed their work, their glowing forms growing brighter as they absorbed the last traces of his spiritual essence. I could feel his presence fading from the world, not gradually like a normal death but suddenly and completely as if he had never existed at all. But something unexpected happened as the feeding reached its peak. Instead of simply consuming Dad's memories, the worms began projecting them back into the physical world, their bioluminescence shifting and changing to create images that hung in the air like three-dimensional photographs. I saw Dad as a child running through the forests around Spruce Flat, his laughter echoing across the valley as he played games that had been forgotten by the outside world. I witnessed his teenage years when he fell in love with my mother during a church social, their courtship conducted along mountain trails that existed only in his memories. The worms showed me his decision to leave Spruce Flat for the opportunities that Nashville offered, the pain of abandoning his ancestral home balanced against the promise of a better life for his future family. They revealed his decades of homesickness for mountains that called to him every spring when the dogwoods bloomed and every autumn when the leaves turned colors that city trees could never match. But most importantly, they showed me why he had insisted on being buried in Spruce Flat despite knowing what the glowing creatures would do to his remains. Dad had discovered the truth about the graveyard worms during his final visit to settle my grandmother's estate, learning that they preserved consciousness in ways that human understanding could not fully grasp. The creatures were not destroyers but transformers, converting human memory into a form that could exist independently of physical death. Every person buried in the cemetery continued to exist within the vast network of glowing organisms, their consciousness preserved and shared among creatures that had become living repositories of mountain history. Dad had chosen this fate deliberately, ensuring that his memories and love for our family would survive in some form even after his body returned to dust. The graveyard worms offered a type of immortality that required surrendering individual identity but preserved the essential experiences that had shaped human lives over generations. As dawn approached, the worms began retreating into their underground network, their work completed for another feeding cycle. Dad's grave looked normal again, just disturbed soil settling over a coffin that now contained only empty flesh. But beneath the surface, his consciousness had joined the vast collective of souls that inhabited the cemetery, this supernatural ecosystem. I left Spruce Flat that morning with a deeper understanding of why our family had been drawn to that remote valley for over 2 centuries. The Mackenzie ancestors were not truly dead but transformed, their memories and personalities preserved within creatures that had learned to feed on the essence of human experience. The knowledge changed my relationship with death and memory in ways that became more apparent over the following months. I found myself remembering stories that Dad had never told me, accessing family history that existed only in the collective consciousness of the graveyard worms. Sometimes I dreamed of glowing tunnels beneath Tennessee mountains, vast networks where the preserved souls of generations shared their accumulated wisdom with organisms that had become the ultimate keepers of human memory. The worms were not parasites but partners, offering immortality in exchange for individual identity. I returned to Spruce Flat every year on the anniversary of Dad's burial, not to visit his grave but to commune with the glowing creatures that have preserved his essence along with that of every other person who chose this unusual form of eternal life. The cemetery appears normal during daylight hours, but darkness reveals the truth about what lies beneath its peaceful exterior. The graveyard worms continue their ancient work, feeding on the memories and souls of the newly dead while preserving human consciousness in forms that transcend traditional understanding of life and death. They offer a type of immortality that comes at the cost of individual existence, transforming personal identity into collective memory. If you ever find yourself in the remote mountains of Tennessee, if you discover a cemetery where the soil glows with bioluminescent life after sunset, remember that not all consumption is destruction. Sometimes the things that seem to devour us are actually preserving us in ways that human language cannot adequately describe. The graveyard worms of Spruce Flat are still feeding, still preserving, still offering their unique form of salvation to anyone willing to surrender individual identity for collective immortality. Dad, this consciousness lives on within their glowing network, along with every other soul that has chosen transformation over traditional death. The mountains remember everything, and the worms ensure that memory becomes eternal. Still awake? Good. Tap subscribe and the bell so you never miss what crawls out of the dark. And drop a comment. Tell us where you're listening from or which moment chilled you most. Story 5. Cursed Moonshine of Dead Man. As hollow, I saw my own death in the bottom of a mason jar, and now I'm racing against time to change what can to be changed. My name is Jake Miller, and I am a construction foreman from Asheville, North Carolina. 2 weeks ago, I was hiking through the deep hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, following old logging roads that haven't seen traffic since the 1940s. What I found hidden in Dead Man, this hollow, wasn't just the remnants of a Prohibition-era moonshine operation. It was something that should have stayed buried with the man who died making it. I've always been drawn to forgotten places. Old homesteads, abandoned mines, ghost towns swallowed by the forest. It is a hobby that started when I was a kid, exploring the mountains with my grandfather. He taught me to read the signs of human habitation that most people miss. The way certain trees grow in straight lines where fence posts once stood. The perfect rectangles of different colored grass that mark old foundations. The subtle depression in the ground that shows where a road used to run. That's how I found the trail to Dead Man, this hollow. It was barely visible, just a slight indent in the forest floor overgrown with mountain laurel and rhododendron. But I could see that it had once been a proper road, wide enough for a Model T Ford to navigate. My grandfather had told me stories about places like this, hidden stills where mountain men made their living one jar at a time during the dry years. The trail wound deeper into the mountains than any marked path I ever followed. After an hour of hiking, I couldn't hear any traffic from the main road. No airplane engines overhead, no cell phone signal, just the sound of my boots on dead leaves and the occasional call of a crow high in the canopy. That is when I smelled it. Something sweet and sour mixed together, like fruit that had gone bad in the sun. The smell got stronger as I followed the trail around a bend and saw the remains of the still. It was tucked into a natural amphitheater carved out of the mountainside, hidden from above by overhanging rocks and from below by a thick stand of pine trees. The copper pot still sat exactly where it had been abandoned 90 years ago, green with verdigris but otherwise intact. Coils of copper tubing snaked through a wooden framework that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. But it was the skeleton that made me stop dead in my tracks. Human bones lay scattered around the base of the still, picked clean by time and weather. A skull grinned up at me from beside the copper pot, and I could see where something had caved in the left side of the cranium. This wasn't someone who had died of old age or accident. Someone had been murdered here, their body left to rot in their own operation. I should have turned around and hiked back to my truck, should have called the sheriff's department and reported finding human remains. But something about the setup drew me closer. The still was more elaborate than any I'd seen in museums or history books. Multiple condensers, complex tubing arrangements, and mason jars still sitting in neat rows along makeshift shelving. And some of those jars still contained liquid, clear as mountain spring water, with just a hint of amber color that caught the filtered sunlight. I picked up one of the jars and held it to the light. No sediment, no cloudiness, no sign that almost a century had affected the contents at all. The mason jar felt warm in my hands, like it had been sitting in sunshine instead of deep forest shade. That's when I noticed the notebook, tucked under a piece of oilcloth beside the skull. A leather-bound journal had somehow survived the decades. The pages were yellow but readable, filled with handwriting in fading ink. The first entry was dated March 15, 1932. Started up the operation again today. Revenue boys been sniffing around the valley, but they found this place yet. Got orders backing up from here to Tennessee. Everybody wants Ezra Blackwood, this special recipe. I flipped through more pages, entry after entry documenting the daily operations of the moonshine business. Recipes, customer names, delivery schedules. But as the months progressed, the tone of the entries began to change. Something ain't right with the new batch. Tastes fine, but folks been saying strange things about it. Old Mrs. Henderson claims it showed her visions of things that hadn't happened yet. Jimmy Walsh says he saw his own funeral after drinking a jar. Probably just mountain superstition, but it's got me thinking. The final entry was dated November 3rd, 1932. They coming for me tonight. Billy Jenkins sold me out to save his own hide. Can hear them moving through the trees below. If they want to put me in my own still, so be it. But I am taking them with me, and anyone who tries to use my recipe after I'm gone is going to get more than they bargained for. The handwriting trailed off into illegible scrawls, like the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence. I closed the notebook and looked around the hollow with new eyes. This wasn't just an abandoned still. It was a crime scene. And according to the journal, Ezra Blackwood had been expecting to die here. But he'd done something to his final batch before they killed him. Something that affected everyone who drank it. Common sense told me to leave those mason jars exactly where they were and get out of Dead Man's Hollow as fast as possible. But curiosity is a powerful thing, especially when you reholding what might be the last sample of genuine Prohibition-era moonshine ever made. I unscrewed the lid of the jar I was holding and took the smallest possible sip. The liquor burned going down, but not like normal alcohol. This was a cold fire that spread through my chest and up into my brain. For a moment, the forest around me seemed to shimmer and shift, like I was looking at it through water. Then the vision hit. I was standing in my own living room, but it was wrong somehow. The furniture was covered in white sheets, and dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through windows I'd never seen before. The photos on the mantelpiece showed me at different ages, but I looked older in all of them. Much older. A woman I didn't recognize walked through the room, her footsteps echoing on hardwood floors. She was carrying flowers, white lilies that filled the air with their funeral scent. When she saw me standing there, she smiled sadly and shook her head. "You shouldn't have gone to that hollow, Jake," she said without moving her lips. "You shouldn't have drunk from that jar." The vision shifted, and I was looking at myself lying in a hospital bed. Tubes and wires connected me to machines that beeped and hummed. My face was gray, my cheeks sunken, my eyes closed. A doctor was talking to someone outside the room, using words like aggressive and inoperable and months, not years. Then I was back in Dead Man's Hollow, gasping like I'd been underwater. The mason jar had fallen from my hands and shattered on the rocks, spilling its contents into the earth where Ezra Blackwood's bones lay scattered. But the vision had felt more real than reality itself. I could still smell those funeral lilies, still hear the beeping of hospital machines. And I knew with absolute certainty that what I'd seen wasn't just a hallucination brought on by drinking 90-year-old moonshine. I had seen my own future, my own death. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've been to 3 different doctors. Blood tests, X-rays, CT scans, MRI imaging. They all show the same thing. A shadow in my chest that wasn't there 6 months ago when I had my last physical. Something growing where it shouldn't be growing, spreading where it shouldn't be spreading. The oncologist wants to start treatment immediately. Surgery followed by chemotherapy and radiation. He talks about 5-year survival rates and quality of life metrics. But I know what I saw in that vision. I know how this story ends. The worst part is that I can stop thinking about the other jars. There were dozens of them still sitting on those shelves in Dead Man's Hollow. Mason jars filled with Ezra Blackwood's cursed moonshine, each one containing visions of death for whoever drinks from it. And I keep wondering if maybe, just maybe, one of those jars might show me something different. I've been back to the hollow 3 times since that first visit. Each time, I tell myself I am just going to document the site properly, maybe report it to the Historical Society. But each time, I find myself standing in front of those shelves, staring at the remaining jars. Yesterday, I met another hiker on the trail. A young guy, maybe 25, with the kind of confidence that only comes from never having faced your own mortality. He was following the same faint path I discovered, drawn by the same curiosity that had led me to Ezra Blackwood, his final resting place. I tried to warn him, told him the hollow was dangerous, that he should turn around and find a different trail. But he just laughed and said he'd been exploring these mountains his whole life. Nothing in Dead Man's Hollow could hurt him. I wonder if he has found the jars yet. I wonder what visions they show him. And I wonder if he be smart enough to leave them alone, or if he make the same mistake I made. Because the truth about Ezra Blackwood, this moonshine ISN, that it shows you visions of your death. It's that drinking it makes those visions come true. The curse ISN, to seeing your future. The curse is that seeing your future seals your fate. I'm writing this down because someone needs to know what is hidden in Dead Man is hollow. Someone needs to understand that some things are buried in these mountains for good reason. The old mountain men knew about forces that modern people have forgotten. They knew about curses and hexes and the price of revenge. Ezra Blackwood made sure that anyone who tried to profit from his death would pay with their own. His murderers probably thought they were just stealing his equipment and his recipe. They didn't. They were drinking their own doom. The hollow is still there, waiting. The jars are still there, promising answers to questions you shouldn't, he asked. And somewhere in those mountains, Ezra Blackwood, his bones are still guarding his final batch of moonshine. Dawn, to go looking for Dead Man, is hollow. Dawn, to follow old logging roads that lead deeper into the mountains than any marked trail. And if you ever find mason jars sitting on forgotten shelves in the deep woods, leave them exactly where they are. Some thirsts errant, meant to be quenched. Some visions errant, meant to be seen. And some curses last forever. Story 6. Endless stairs of the Biltmore estate. I climbed those stairs for 6 hours straight. And when I looked back, the ground was still right there behind me. My name is Tom Bradley, and I am a wilderness photographer from Charlotte. 2 months ago, I was hiking through the deep forest surrounding the Biltmore estate in North Carolina, searching for the perfect shot of autumn colors. What I found instead was a staircase that shouldn't exist, leading to places that shouldn't be possible. The official Biltmore property ends at the garden walls, but the forest beyond stretches for miles into the Blue Ridge Mountains. Most tourists never venture past the manicured grounds. They don't. Do you know about the old logging roads that snake through the woods, or the forgotten paths that date back to before George Vanderbilt ever laid eyes on this land? I've been exploring these hidden trails for years, always with my camera, always looking for that one shot that would make my career. October 15th was perfect. The maples were burning red against a steel gray sky, and morning mist clung to the valleys like something out of a fairy tale. I left my truck at a ranger station 3 miles back and hiked deep into the forest, following a deer trail that led away from any marked path. That is when I saw them. Rising out of the forest floor like the spine of some buried giant, a set of stone stairs climbed steadily upward, disappearing into the canopy above. They were old, older than the Biltmore house itself. Moss covered every surface, and small trees had taken root between the stones. But the strangest thing was how intact they were. No crumbling edges, no missing steps. Just a perfect staircase leading up into nothing. I checked my GPS. According to the satellite map, I was standing in the middle of unbroken forest. No structures, no ruins. Nothing that would explain a staircase this elaborate. I took out my camera and started shooting, thinking I stumbled onto something incredible. Maybe the remains of an old mountain resort, or some forgotten Gilded Age folly. The first 20 steps felt normal enough. Solid stone under my hiking boots, the familiar burn in my calves as I climbed. But as I got higher, I started to notice things that didn't make sense. The trees around me weren't getting smaller as they should when you gain elevation. If anything, they were getting larger. Ancient oaks with trunks so massive it would take 6 men holding hands to circle them. Chestnuts that had somehow survived the blight that wiped them out a century ago. And the silence was absolute. No bird calls, no wind through the leaves, no insects buzzing. Just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps on stone. At step 50, I turned to look back down. The forest floor was still visible, maybe 60 feet below. Normal enough for climbing 50 steps. But something felt wrong about the perspective. It was like looking down through water, everything slightly distorted and shimmering. I kept climbing. By step 100, I should have been well above the tree line for this elevation. Instead, the canopy seemed to stretch endlessly overhead, and shafts of sunlight filtered down through leaves that moved without any wind to stir them. I stopped to check my altimeter. It read the same elevation as when I started. That's when I noticed my watch had stopped. The digital display was frozen at 9:47 a.m., the exact moment I stepped onto the first stone. I tapped the face, pressed the buttons. Nothing. The battery had been full that morning, and I owned this watch for 5 years without a single malfunction. I should have turned around then. Should have walked back down those 100 steps and returned to my normal life. Instead, I did what photographers do when faced with the impossible. I started documenting it. The photos I took should have been impossible. My camera showed trees that weren't there when I looked with my naked eye. Carved symbols on the stone steps that appeared only through the lens. And in the background of every shot, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, human figures standing perfectly still. At step 200, I could see them clearly without the camera. They were dressed in clothes from different eras. A woman in a 1950s dress, her hair perfectly styled despite standing in the middle of a forest. A man in overalls that looked like they belonged in a Depression-era photograph. A child in knickers and suspenders, like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting. None of them moved. None of them breathed. They just watched me climb with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. The worst part was that I recognized some of them. The woman in the 1950s dress looked exactly like my grandmother, who had died when I was 12. Same blue eyes, same gentle smile, same small scar on her chin from a childhood accident. But my grandmother had never been to North Carolina. She lived her entire life in Ohio, never traveling more than 50 miles from the farm where she was born. At step 300, time started behaving strangely. I look at my watch, see it still frozen at 9:47, then blink and suddenly the light filtering through the canopy would shift from morning gold to afternoon amber. But when I checked the watch again, it still read 9:47. I'd been climbing for what felt like hours, but according to every timepiece I carried, no time had passed at all. The stairs began to curve then, spiraling around some invisible center point. With each turn, the forest changed around me. Sometimes I was walking through a primeval wilderness that looked like it had never felt the touch of human hands. Other times, I glimpsed the shadows of buildings that had never been built, roads that had never been paved, entire cities that existed only in the spaces between what was real and what might have been. At step 400, I heard the voices. They whispered my name from the trees around me. Dozens of voices all speaking at once. Some I recognized, my grandmother, my father who passed 3 years ago, a college friend who died in a car accident. But others were strangers, people I never met but somehow knew. They were calling me home, telling me to keep climbing, promising that everything would make sense if I just reached the top. That's when I realized I couldn't see the bottom anymore. I turned around, expecting to see the forest floor far below. Instead, there was nothing but more stairs descending into mist. The steps I already climbed stretched down and down until they disappeared into gray fog that hadn't been there before. It was like the staircase had become infinite in both directions, a stone ribbon suspended in empty space. At step 500, I met myself. He was sitting on one of the steps about 50 feet ahead, wearing the same clothes I was wearing, carrying the same camera. But his hair was gray, his face lined with years I hadn't lived yet. When he saw me approaching, he stood up and shook his head slowly. "You have to go back," the older version of myself said without speaking, the words appearing directly in my mind. I've been climbing these stairs for 30 years. There is no top, there is no bottom, there is only the climb. I tried to speak, to ask him how this was possible, but no sound came from my throat. The air itself seemed too thick for words. He pointed back down the stairs, toward the mist where the beginning should be. "Some of us figure it out in time," he continued. "Some of us remember that we have lives to return to. Others keep climbing until they become part of the stairs themselves." He gestured to the stones beneath our feet, and I saw what I missed before. The moss wasn't moss at all. It was hair, human hair, growing from faces that had been carved into the stone. Eyes that tracked my movement, mouths that opened and closed silently, trying to warn me of something I couldn't understand. The stairs were made of people who had climbed too far and become trapped forever in stone and time. I ran then, down the endless staircase, past my older self who smiled sadly as I passed. Down through the shifting forest, past the watching figures in their period clothes, past the impossible trees and the light that belonged to no particular time of day. My legs burned and my lungs screamed for air, but I kept running, counting steps backward from 500, 400, 300. At step 50, I could see the forest floor again, real and solid and blessedly normal. At step 20, I heard birds singing. At step 10, my watch started ticking again, jumping from 9:47 to 3:23 in the space of a heartbeat. When my boots touched the ground, I was back where I started. Same deer trail, same October afternoon, same familiar forest around the Biltmore estate. But 6 hours had passed, and my camera's memory card was full of photos I didn't remember taking. I've looked at those pictures 1,000 times since that day. They show the stairs, the impossible forest, the figures watching from the shadows. But in every single photo, there is something that makes my blood run cold. In the background, barely visible but definitely there, I can see myself climbing the stairs. Not just once, but dozens of times. Different clothes, different seasons, different years. Like I've been climbing those stairs my whole life, in versions of reality that exist alongside this one. And every night, I dream about climbing. In my dreams, I always go just a little bit farther than I did that day. Step 550, step 600, step 1000. And each time I dream it, I wake up with moss under my fingernails and a taste of stone dust in my mouth. 2 months have passed since I found those stairs. I tried to forget them, tried to convince myself it was all some kind of hallucination brought on by dehydration or altitude sickness. But I can feel them calling to me from the deep forest around Biltmore. Calling me back to finish what I started. Because the truth is, I never really left those stairs at all. Part of me is still climbing, still searching for the top that doesn't exist. And every day, that part gets stronger, pulling at the rest of me like gravity. The stairs are patient. They've been waiting in that forest for longer than the Biltmore estate has existed, longer than anyone can remember. They wait for me too, until the day I finally stop fighting and let them carry me up into whatever impossible place they lead. But until that day comes, I have to warn people. I have to tell someone what is hidden in those woods, even though I know they won. Do you believe me? Because somewhere out there, another photographer is following a deer trail through the forest, looking for the perfect shot. And when they see those moss-covered stairs rising out of the ground, they're going to do exactly what I did. They're going to start climbing. And once you start, you never really stop. Story 7, White Mist. I should have never spoken her name aloud. The warning was carved into a rotting fence post at the base of Pilot Mountain. Weathered letters barely visible through decades of Carolina rain. But I was there for a story, chasing folklore for my podcast about forgotten American legends. The local historian in Mount Airy had mentioned the White Witch in passing, dismissing her as superstition. That dismissal should have been my first clue. The white mist that perpetually crowns Pilot Mountain has been there for over a century. Meteorologists call it a weather anomaly. The Cherokee who lived here first called it something else entirely. They avoided the peak long before European settlers arrived, speaking of spirits that demanded respect. The settlers should have listened. My rental car struggled up the winding mountain road as afternoon shadows stretched between ancient oaks. Cell service had died miles back, leaving me with only the scratchy AM radio and the growing certainty that I was making a mistake. The deeper into the Appalachians I drove, the more the modern world seemed to peel away like old paint. The hollow where Sarah Whitmore once lived sits in a natural bowl carved between ridges, hidden from the main road by a wall of rhododendron and mountain laurel. Local records from 1891 describe it as a place where healing herbs grew wild and a woman with strange eyes helped birthing mothers and fevered children. The same records that would later condemn her. I found the remains of her cabin by following a creek that ran black with tannins from centuries of fallen leaves. Stone foundations poked through the forest floor like broken teeth. Wild ginseng and bloodroot still grew in what had been her garden, thriving despite the shadow that Pilot Mountain cast even at noon. The white mist above seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, drifting down the mountainside in ghostly fingers. The children started falling ill in late September 1891. First it was the Morrison twins, burning with fever and speaking in tongues. Then the Caldwell baby, crying constantly with a wailing that echoed through the hollow. Within a week, every child under 10 was sick with something the local doctor could not name or cure. Something that made their eyes roll back white and their small bodies convulse with unnatural strength. Sarah Whitmore had been treating the children with her herbs and remedies for months. She knew every family in the hollow, had delivered half the babies herself. But fear makes people search for someone to blame, and a woman who lived alone with her strange knowledge of plants and healing became an easy target. Especially when the preacher started calling her practices ungodly. I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down as I explored the ruins. Every step seemed to disturb something that preferred to remain hidden. Pilot Mountain loomed overhead, its white crown growing thicker as the sun dropped toward the western ridges. The mist moved wrong, defying wind patterns, coiling downward like smoke from an unseen fire. The mob came for Sarah on October 13th. 27 men from the hollow and the valleys beyond, carrying rope and righteous fury. They found her gathering willow bark by the creek, her gray hair loose and wild, her pale eyes reflecting the afternoon light like polished stones. She did not run. Local accounts say she simply looked at each man in turn, memorizing their faces, whispering their names like she was adding them to some invisible ledger. They dragged her to the old oak that still stands near the creek. Its trunk bears scars from the rope, dark grooves that never healed. As they fitted the noose around her neck, Sarah Whitmore spoke her final words. Not a plea for mercy or a declaration of innocence. A curse that turned the air cold and made strong men shiver despite their anger. She cursed the mountain itself to remember what they had done, cursed the peak to wear eternal white as a shroud of shame. And she cursed anyone who would speak her name with mockery or disrespect to know the weight of her sorrow firsthand. The rope snapped taut, and Sarah Whitmore died with her pale eyes fixed on Pilot Mountain, his summit. The white mist appeared within hours of her death. I found her grave marker while the last daylight filtered through the canopy. A simple stone carved with her name and dates, surrounded by offerings left by people who still remembered. Wild flowers, small stones, bundles of herbs tied with red thread. Someone had been here recently. The flowers were fresh. Standing over her grave, I made my fatal mistake. I pulled out my recorder and began speaking her story aloud, using her name repeatedly, describing her death in clinical detail for my podcast audience. I called her a victim of superstition and ignorance, dismissed the curse as folklore, laughed at the idea that mist could be supernatural. The white fog above grew thicker with each word. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. My breath came out in sharp puffs as an unnatural cold settled over the hollow. The mist began descending the mountainside faster now, reaching down through the trees like searching fingers. It carried something with it. Not a scent exactly, but a presence that made my skin crawl and my throat tighten with inexplicable dread. I ran from my car, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over fallen logs. Behind me, the white mist followed, moving with purpose now, flowing downhill like a river of ethereal light. It made no sound, but somehow I could hear it anyway. A whisper that might have been wind through leaves or might have been a woman's voice speaking names in the gathering darkness. The car started on the third try, headlights cutting through fog so thick I could barely see the road. The mist pressed against my windows, leaving handprint shapes that faded and reformed like some ghostly communication I could not understand. Every turn seemed wrong, every familiar landmark swallowed by white that glowed with its own pale luminescence. I drove for what felt like hours through that impossible fog, following a road that should have led back to civilization but instead wound deeper into hollows I had never seen. The radio played nothing but static punctuated by what sounded like old-time gospel music sung by voices that belonged to no earthly choir. When the mist finally parted, I found myself in my hotel parking lot in Mount Airy, with no memory of how I had gotten there. My car, its odometer showed 300 additional miles. My clothes were soaked with moisture that smelled of herbs and grave dirt. And carved into the hood of my rental car were letters that spelled out Sarah Whitmore's name in a script I had never seen but somehow recognized. The sickness started that night, not the fever that took the children in 1891, but something else. A wasting that began in my bones and spread outward like frost forming on glass. Food lost all taste, sleep brought dreams of pale eyes and reaching mist. My reflection grew stranger each day, my own eyes taking on a milky cast that doctors could not explain. I tried to leave North Carolina, but my car broke down at the state line. The mechanic said the engine was fine, but it would not start when pointed north or south or east. Only west, back toward the mountains, back toward Pilot Mountain and its crown of eternal white. The curse is real, and it has claimed me as surely as the rope claimed Sarah Whitmore over a century ago. I am bound to these mountains now, drawn back again and again to the hollow where she died. Each visit leaves me weaker, more translucent, more like the mist itself. The white fog that caps Pilot Mountain is not weather. It is memory made manifest, the concentrated sorrow and rage of a woman who died for helping children. It is a warning that some names should never be spoken lightly. Some stories should never be told without respect. And now it is my prison, just as it was always meant to be hers. I record this final warning from Sarah Whitmore's grave, surrounded by offerings I now understand were never meant to honor the dead but to appease the living. The mist descends around me as I speak, welcoming me home to a hollow where time moves differently and the mountain remembers everything. If you ever find yourself near Pilot Mountain, if you see the white mist reaching down through ancient trees, remember this story. Remember that some curses echo across generations, that some names carry power in their syllables, that some mountains hold grudges longer than human memory. And whatever you do, never speak the name of the White Witch of Pilot Mountain with anything but reverence. She is listening. She's always listening. Story 8. Watchers. I never believed in shadow people until my Honda died at mile marker 364 on the Blue Ridge Parkway. And I saw them standing in perfect formation along the tree line, watching me with eyes that weren't there. My name is Frank Morrison, and I am a long-haul trucker from Richmond. I've driven every highway from Maine to Florida, seen things that would make most people question their sanity. But nothing prepared me for what happened on that October night in 2023, when I took the scenic route through Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains and learned why locals avoid the parkway after dark. The Blue Ridge Parkway stretches 469 miles through Virginia and North Carolina, connecting Shenandoah National Park to Great Smoky Mountains National Park. During the day, it's one of America's most beautiful drives, rolling mountains covered in oak and maple, scenic overlooks that stretch for miles, tourist attractions every few miles selling apple butter and mountain crafts. At night, it becomes something else entirely. I should have known better than to take that road. My usual cargo run from Norfolk to Asheville follows Interstate 64 and Interstate 77, a straight shot that gets me there in 6 hours. But my dispatcher had rerouted me at the last minute, something about construction delays and weight restrictions. He suggested I take the parkway, said it would add maybe an hour, but the scenery was worth it. What he didn't tell me was that my cargo manifest listed electronic equipment, computers, tablets, smartphones, all the modern technology that keeps our world connected. What he didn't know was that there are things in those mountains that hate our electronic world, things that have been waiting centuries for the chance to silence our constant digital chatter. I entered the parkway just south of Waynesboro around 9 p.m., planning to reach Asheville by 3 in the morning. The autumn foliage was past peak, but even in the darkness I could see the skeletal beauty of the hardwood trees. The road wound through the mountains like a ribbon, 2 lanes of perfect asphalt with no streetlights. No guardrails in most places, just the endless forest pressing in from both sides. For the first 50 miles, everything seemed normal. I made good time, keeping my speed steady at 45 to match the parkway's limit. My CB radio crackled with occasional chatter from other truckers on the interstates below, and my phone showed 3 bars of signal. All the comforting sounds of modern civilization humming along exactly as designed. That's when I started noticing the figures. At first, I thought they were trees. The Blue Ridge is full of dead oaks and hickories, victims of drought and disease that stand like sentinels along the roadside. But these shapes were too uniform, too perfectly spaced, and they seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking directly at them. By mile marker 200, I knew they weren't trees. They stood 8 to 10 feet tall, impossibly thin, with proportions that hurt to look at directly. Their bodies seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it, creating shadows so deep they looked like tears in reality itself. They had no discernible features, no faces, no clothing, no details that would mark them as anything remotely human. But they watched me pass with an attention that was unmistakably intelligent and deeply malevolent. The first time I saw one clearly, I nearly drove off the road. It stood perfectly still about 20 feet from the pavement, its featureless head tracking my truck as I passed. When I checked my mirrors, it was gone. But in the next curve, there was another one, then another. By mile marker 250, they were everywhere. They lined both sides of the road like an honor guard from hell, spaced exactly 30 feet apart as far as I could see in my headlights. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all perfectly motionless except for that slow, deliberate turning of their heads to follow my progress through their domain. My CB radio started picking up static around mile marker 280. Not the usual interference you get in the mountains, but something else, rhythmic pulses that almost sounded like Morse code, if Morse code could convey pure malevolence. My cell phone showed no bars now, the screen flickering between signal and no service like it couldn't decide what reality to believe. The temperature gauge on my dashboard began climbing around mile marker 320. Not overheating, exactly, but running hotter than normal even though the October night was cool. My electrical systems were struggling. headlights dimming and brightening in patterns that matched no earthly rhythm. That's when I realized what was happening. These shadow entities weren't just watching me. They were interfering with every electronic device in my truck. My radio, my phone, my GPS, even the engine management computer that controlled fuel injection and timing. They were systematically shutting down the technological umbilical cord that connected me to the civilized world. Around mile marker 350, my engine started missing. Small hiccups at first, barely noticeable hesitations in the smooth rumble of the diesel. But the misses came more frequently as I passed more watchers, until my truck was bucking and lurching like a horse trying to throw its rider. I pulled into a scenic overlook at mile marker 360, hoping to diagnose the problem and maybe get a cell signal to call for help. The parking area was empty except for one other vehicle, a late model sedan with Virginia plates, sitting dark and abandoned in the far corner. As soon as I shut off the engine, the silence hit me like a physical blow. No traffic sounds, no wind through the trees, no night insects or distant highway noise. Just perfect, absolute silence that pressed against my eardrums like cotton stuffed too deep. Then I heard the footsteps. They came from all directions at once. The soft whisper of feet that made no real sound but somehow communicated movement through the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, playing the beam across the tree line that surrounded the overlook. They were there, all of them, dozens of shadow figures standing just beyond the reach of my light. Their impossible forms creating holes in the darkness that seemed to go down forever. They were closer than they had been on the road, maybe 50 feet away, and they were all facing me now with their featureless attention. My flashlight began to flicker. The beam grew weaker with each pulse, as if something was draining the batteries even as I watched. Within minutes, it died completely, leaving me alone in the darkness with things that shouldn't to exist. That is when my truck's electrical system failed entirely. Every light on the dashboard went dark. The radio died with a static-filled gasp. Even my digital watch stopped working, its display fading to black as if the very concept of time had been canceled in this place. But in the darkness, I could see them more clearly than ever. The shadow people were moving now, gliding across the parking lot with movements that defied every law of physics I understood. They didn't walk so much as flow, like smoke given form and purpose. I ran back to my truck and tried to start the engine. The starter motor turned over, but there was no spark, no fuel delivery, no response from any of the computer-controlled systems that modern diesels depend on. My truck had become nothing more than 10 tons of dead metal and plastic. The shadow people were surrounding the truck now, their forms pressing close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from whatever they were made of. Through the windshield, I watched them examine my vehicle with the methodical attention of scientists studying a specimen. One of them pressed what might have been a hand against the driver's side window. The glass didn't break, didn't even crack, but frost began spreading outward from the point of contact in patterns that looked almost like circuit boards or computer chips. As if the entity was somehow downloading information about the technology it was touching. That is when I understood what these things really were. They weren't just random supernatural entities. They were some kind of immune response. The mountains' answer to the electronic invasion that had been creeping through their domain for decades. Every cell tower, every satellite dish, every GPS unit and smartphone that had passed through their territory had been cataloged and studied. Now they were taking action. My cargo, 20 pallets of cutting-edge electronics worth more than my house. They weren't just interfering with my truck. They were after the technology I was carrying. And they were smart enough to know that disabling my vehicle was the most efficient way to get it. The temperature inside the cab began dropping fast. My breath came out in visible puffs, and ice began forming on the inside of the windows. But the cold wasn't natural. It carried something else with it, a wrongness that went deeper than temperature. It was the cold of deep space, of places where warmth and life had never existed. Through the frost-covered windshield, I could see more shadow people emerging from the forest. Not dozens this time, but hundreds, maybe thousands. They filled the overlook like a black tide, their forms overlapping and blending until the entire parking area looked like a lake of liquid darkness. And in that darkness, I saw lights. Not electric lights. These things clearly hated anything electronic. These were different. Older, flickering points of illumination that might have been fires, or stars, or something else entirely. They moved through the mass of shadow people like neurons firing in some vast, alien brain. The lights were getting brighter, and I realized with growing horror that they were eyes. Not human eyes, nothing that had ever been human, but points of awareness that burned with intelligence older than civilization. These shadow people weren't just mindless entities. They were organized, directed, part of something larger and more terrible than I had imagined. My truck began rocking gently from side to side, as if the shadow people were testing its weight and balance. Ice continued spreading across every surface, but it wasn't random anymore. The frost patterns were forming specific shapes, geometric designs that looked like some kind of writing or mathematical formula. They were marking my truck, claiming it for purposes I didn't want to understand. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The rocking ceased, the temperature began to rise. The shadow people stepped back from my truck, creating a clear circle around the vehicle. Even their attention seemed to shift away from me, focused now on something else entirely. That is when I heard the sound. It came from the direction of the abandoned sedan in the far corner of the overlook. A low, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on glass. But there was something desperate about it, something that spoke of trapped panic and fading hope. The shadow people were moving toward the sound now, flowing across the parking lot like a black river. As they passed in front of my headlights, which had somehow started working again, I could see through their translucent forms to the sedan beyond. There was someone inside that car, someone alive. The figure in the driver's seat was barely visible through the frost-covered windows, but I could make out the frantic movement of hands pounding against the glass. The shadow people surrounded the vehicle completely, pressing against it from all sides until the car looked like it was drowning in living darkness. The knocking stopped. The figure in the car went still. And one by one, the shadow people began to fade away, becoming transparent and then invisible until the overlook was empty except for my truck and the silent sedan. My electrical systems came back online all at once. Dashboard lights blazed to life. The radio crackled with sudden chatter, and my cell phone showed full bars. Even my flashlight worked perfectly when I tested it. Everything was exactly as it had been before the encounter, as if the last hour had been nothing more than a nightmare. But the sedan was still there, windows covered with that unnatural frost. And when I finally worked up the courage to investigate, I found what I expected and dreaded in equal measure. The driver was still in his seat, hands pressed against the window where he had been trying to escape. But he was frozen solid, his body covered with the same geometric patterns of ice that had marked my truck. His eyes were open, staring at something beyond the visible world, and his mouth was set in a silent scream that would never end. The man, this wallet identified him as Robert Chen, age 32, from Arlington. According to the registration in his glove compartment, he had been driving a rental car. According to the timestamp on his parking receipt, he had stopped at this overlook 3 hours before I arrived. 3 hours of being slowly frozen to death while shadow people studied the electronics in his hybrid sedan, learning everything they needed to know about our connected, digital world. I called the state police from the safety of my truck, reporting what I claimed was a medical emergency. I didn't mention the shadow people or the supernatural freezing. I just said I had found a man who appeared to have died from exposure, which was technically true. The authorities arrived within an hour. Squad cars, ambulances, even a helicopter to airlift the body to a medical examiner. They treated it as a straightforward case of hypothermia, though they couldn't explain how someone could freeze to death in 40-degree weather inside a heated vehicle. I gave my statement and got back on the road, eager to put as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed overlook. My truck ran perfectly for the remaining 100 miles to Asheville, all systems functioning normally, as if the shadow people had gotten what they wanted from their encounter with modern technology. But I know better now. I know what is out there in the Blue Ridge Mountains, watching our highways and cataloging our electronic dependence. They relearning about us, studying our weaknesses, preparing for something that I don't want to imagine. I've driven the Blue Ridge Parkway dozens of times since that night, always during daylight hours, always with my electronics turned off or covered. I've never seen the shadow people again, but I know they were there, watching, waiting, growing stronger as more and more technology passes through their ancient domain. Other truckers have reported similar experiences now. Electrical failures, dead zones where cell phones don't work, vehicles that break down for no reason in certain stretches of the parkway. The incidents are increasing, becoming more frequent and more severe. But the authorities don't To listen. They blame solar flares and magnetic anomalies, equipment failures, and human error. They can to accept that there might be something in those mountains that actively opposes our electronic civilization. I know the truth. The shadow people are real, and they planning something. Every smartphone that dies on the parkway, every GPS unit that malfunctions, every car computer that glitches, it is all being studied, cataloged, understood. They relearning how to fight back against the digital world that has invaded their territory. And when they were ready, when they've learned enough about our weaknesses and dependencies, they were going to shut it all down. The next time you drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains at night, pay attention to the tree line. Look for shapes that are too tall, too thin, too perfectly still to be natural. And if your electronics start failing, if your engine begins missing, if the temperature drops for no reason, Don, T stop. Don, T investigate. Don, to try to help anyone you might find stranded on the roadside. Just drive fast, and Don, to look back. Because the shadow people are watching, and they almost ready to make their move. Story 9. Hannah S. Cemetery. Hannah S. voice was beautiful when she first began singing to me in that overgrown North Carolina graveyard, but I should have noticed that every criminal buried around her was starting to stir beneath their cracked headstones. The melody drifted through the autumn mist like something from a church hymnal, pure and sweet and utterly wrong for a cemetery that had been abandoned for over 60 years. I had come to Macon County to document forgotten burial grounds for my genealogy research, but Hannah S. Cemetery held secrets that had nothing to do with family trees or historical preservation. My name is Robert Hayes, and I trace bloodlines for families who want to understand their heritage before it disappears entirely. Most of my work involves courthouse records and online databases, but sometimes I have to visit the physical locations where our ancestors are buried to find the stories that official documents never tell. Hannah S. Cemetery sits on a hillside outside Franklin, North Carolina, accessible only by a dirt road that washouts and landslides have made nearly impassable. The county stopped maintaining the site in 1962 after repeated incidents of vandalism and disturbing reports from visitors who claimed to experience supernatural encounters among the weathered headstones. Local records showed that the cemetery had been established in 1847 as a community burial ground for families who lived in the remote mountain hollows surrounding Franklin. But by the early 1900s, it had also become the final resting place for criminals and outcasts who were refused burial in consecrated church graveyards. Hannah Morrison was buried there in 1889 at the age of 16, the victim of a consumption epidemic that swept through the mountain communities that winter. Her headstone described her as a beloved daughter whose beautiful singing voice had brought joy to everyone who knew her, a young woman taken too soon by a disease that had no respect for innocence or talent. But Hannah was surrounded by much different company in death. The graves nearest to hers belonged to men who had been hanged for murder, horse thieves who had died in gun battles with law enforcement, and various other criminals whose names were whispered with fear rather than remembered with fondness. According to local folklore, Hannah's pure spirit had somehow become connected to the malevolent energies of the violent men buried around her, creating a supernatural trap that lured visitors into staying longer than was safe. Her beautiful singing would attract people to the cemetery, but the criminals would attack anyone who lingered after sunset. I arrived at the site around 3 p.m. on a gray October afternoon, planning to spend a few hours photographing headstones and recording GPS coordinates for the family histories I was researching. The cemetery was smaller than I had expected, maybe 200 graves scattered across a hillside that was being reclaimed by wild honeysuckle and mountain laurel. Hannah's grave was easy to find near the center of the burial ground, marked by a white marble headstone that had somehow survived decades of weather and neglect in much better condition than the surrounding monuments. Her carved epitaph was still clearly legible, praising her voice and mourning her early death in language that spoke of genuine love and devastating loss. But the graves around Hannah told much darker stories. Crude wooden markers identified men with names like Black Bill Morrison and Three Finger Pete, criminals whose reputations had been so notorious that their burial locations were marked more as warnings than memorials. These were not beloved family members but dangerous men who had terrorized the mountain communities during the lawless years of the late 1800s. I began photographing Hannah's headstone for my records when I first heard her singing, a wordless melody that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than any visible source. The voice was exactly as her epitaph had described, beautiful and pure, carrying emotional depth that spoke of someone who had truly understood the power of music to touch human souls. But there was something else in that voice, a loneliness so profound it made my chest ache with sympathetic pain. Hannah had been dead for over a century, but her singing conveyed the desperate isolation of someone who had been trapped in the same location for decades without any living company except the violent men buried in the graves surrounding her monument. I found myself sitting on a fallen log near her headstone, listening to the ethereal melody and forgetting about the genealogy work that had brought me to this remote location. The singing was hypnotic, drawing me deeper into a trance-like state where time seemed to move at a different pace than the normal world. The sun began to set without my noticing, painting the overgrown cemetery in shades of gold and crimson that made the weathered headstones look like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. Hannah's voice grew stronger as darkness approached, her melody becoming more complex and emotionally compelling with each passing minute. That was when I saw her for the first time. She materialized near her own headstone like morning mist taking human form, a young woman in a white dress that seemed to glow with its own soft light. Her hair was long and dark, her features delicate and aristocratic, her eyes filled with an intelligence and kindness that made her instantly appealing despite her supernatural nature. Hannah smiled when she realized I could see her, her expression brightening with the joy of someone who had been alone for too long finally discovering another person who could acknowledge her presence. She continued singing, but now her melody carried notes of welcome and gratitude rather than the desperate loneliness I had heard earlier. I should have left then, should have recognized the danger of staying in an abandoned cemetery after dark with only a ghost for company. But Hannah was not frightening in any traditional sense. She seemed genuinely happy to have a visitor, grateful for human contact after more than a century of isolation among the graves of violent criminals. The temperature around her headstone remained comfortable despite the autumn chill that was settling over the rest of the cemetery. Hannah's presence created a bubble of warmth and peace that made it easy to forget the warnings I had read about supernatural encounters at this location. But as full darkness settled over the hillside, I began to sense other presences stirring among the surrounding graves. Shadows that moved independently of wind or moonlight. Sounds of footsteps on ground that should have been too soft to carry the weight of walking figures. Whispers in voices that belonged to men who had been dead for generations. Hannah's expression began to show concern as she noticed my growing awareness of the other spirits. Her beautiful singing taking on urgent notes that seemed designed to hold my attention and keep me focused on her rather than the malevolent forces gathering in the darkness around us. The criminals buried near Hannah's grave were awakening, drawn by the presence of a living person who had remained in their territory past the sunset hour that marked the beginning of their supernatural activity. These were not gentle spirits seeking peace or resolution, but predators who had retained their violent natures despite decades in the ground. I could see them now at the edges of my vision, transparent figures wearing the rough clothing of 19th century mountain men. Their forms were distorted by the violent deaths they had suffered, some showing rope burns around their necks, others bearing gunshot wounds that still leaked spectral blood, all of them moving with the predatory intent that had defined their mortal lives. Hannah's singing became more desperate as the criminal spirits closed in, her voice trying to create a protective barrier of pure music around the space where I sat transfixed by her ghostly beauty. But she was only one spirit against dozens of malevolent entities, and her power was fading as they drew closer to their intended victim. The realization hit me then that Hannah was not luring visitors to the cemetery for her own malicious purposes. She was trying to warn them, using her beautiful voice to attract attention and her presence to provide comfort during the brief window of safety that existed between sunset and full darkness. But her efforts were ultimately futile because anyone who stayed long enough to truly appreciate her singing would inevitably remain past the hour when the criminal spirits gained enough power to attack. Hannah was trapped in an eternal cycle of attracting visitors she could not protect, watching helplessly as violent ghosts claimed victims she had inadvertently drawn into danger. The first attack came from Three-Finger Pete, a horse thief whose spectral form lunged at me with claws extended like some supernatural beast. I felt cold fingers rake across my back, tearing through my jacket and leaving wounds that burned with unnatural fire despite producing no visible blood. More criminal spirits joined the assault, surrounding me with a circle of malevolent entities who had retained all their mortal hatred and violence without any of the physical limitations that had eventually led to their deaths. They attacked with supernatural strength and speed, their ghostly weapons leaving spiritual wounds that were more painful than any physical injury I had ever experienced. But Hannah fought back with the only weapon available to her, raising her voice in a song so pure and powerful that it drove the criminal spirits back like holy water thrown at demons. Her melody created waves of spiritual energy that disrupted their attack and gave me precious seconds to understand what was really happening in this cursed cemetery. Hannah was not connected to the criminal spirits by choice but by circumstance, her grave unfortunately positioned among men who had transformed their final resting place into a supernatural hunting ground. She had spent over a century trying to protect visitors from the malevolent entities she could not escape, using her beautiful voice as both lure and shield in a doomed effort to save lives while remaining trapped among the dead. The battle between Hannah's protective song and the criminals' malevolent energy created a supernatural storm that raged across the hillside cemetery, toppling headstones and uprooting trees as spiritual forces clashed with devastating intensity. I was caught in the middle of powers that existed beyond human understanding, witnessing a conflict that had probably been raging for decades without any living person ever realizing what was happening. But Hannah was weakening under the sustained assault from so many criminal spirits, her voice beginning to crack and fade as exhaustion overcame her desperate efforts to maintain my protection. The circle of violent ghosts began closing in again, their transparent forms becoming more solid and dangerous as her defensive song lost its power to hold them back. I understood then that survival required me to help Hannah rather than simply relying on her protection. The criminal spirits were drawn to violence and fear, feeding on negative emotions that strengthened their ability to affect the physical world. But Hannah represented everything they opposed: innocence, beauty, selfless protection of others. I began singing along with Hannah, adding my voice to hers in a harmony that neither of us had planned but both recognized as necessary for survival. My untrained vocals were nothing compared to her supernatural beauty, but the combination of living and dead voices created something powerful enough to drive back the advancing criminal spirits. The malevolent entities retreated to the edges of the cemetery, frustrated by their inability to overcome the protective barrier created by our combined song. But I knew they would return as soon as Hannah and I stopped singing, and I could not maintain the harmony indefinitely without eventually succumbing to exhaustion. Hannah must have understood this as well, because her expression showed a mixture of gratitude and desperate sadness as she realized that even my help could not break the cycle that had trapped her for over a century. She was doomed to remain in this cemetery forever, trying to protect visitors while being unable to defeat the criminal spirits who made her efforts ultimately futile. But our duet had created something neither of us expected, a moment of perfect spiritual connection that allowed Hannah to share her true story and reveal the secret that could finally bring peace to the cursed cemetery. The criminal spirits were not simply violent ghosts but souls who had been bound to this location by a curse placed on them by their victims' families. The curse could only be broken by someone who willingly chose to sing with Hannah, creating the harmony between innocence and experience that would release all the spirits trapped in the cemetery. My decision to help rather than flee had provided the missing element needed to end decades of supernatural conflict. As our voices blended in perfect harmony, light began to emanate from Hannah's grave and spread across the hillside, touching each criminal spirit and transforming their malevolent energy into something peaceful and ready for whatever waited beyond death. The violent ghosts stopped their attack and began to fade, their expressions showing relief rather than anger as they were finally released from the curse that had bound them to endless violence. Hannah herself began to fade as well, but her expression showed joy rather than sadness as she realized that her long vigil was finally ending. She had spent over a century protecting visitors from spirits she could not defeat, but my willingness to stay and sing with her had provided the key to everyone's salvation. The cemetery fell silent as the last spirit disappeared, leaving only moonlight and the sound of wind through overgrown vegetation. I was alone among the headstones, but the oppressive atmosphere of violence and danger had been replaced by a sense of peace that made the location feel like a normal burial ground rather than a supernatural battleground. I left Hannah's cemetery that night knowing that I had witnessed something extraordinary, a confrontation between good and evil that had been resolved through music rather than violence. The genealogy research that had brought me to the location seemed trivial compared to the spiritual battle I had helped win through nothing more than willingness to sing along with a lonely ghost. But Hannah's influence on my life did not end with her departure to whatever realm awaits peaceful spirits. I found that my own voice had been changed by our supernatural duet, carrying new depth and emotional power that made music a more important part of my daily existence than it had ever been before. I returned to visit Hannah's cemetery every year on the anniversary of her death, Not because her ghost still haunts the location, but because the peaceful atmosphere she helped create makes it a perfect place for reflection and remembrance. The criminal spirits are gone, the curse is broken, and the hillside has become a genuine memorial to all who rest there rather than a supernatural trap. The local authorities have begun maintaining the cemetery again, clearing away the overgrowth and repairing damaged headstones so that Hannah Morrison and even the reformed criminal spirits can be remembered with dignity rather than fear. Her beautiful voice no longer echoes across the hillside, but visitors often report feeling an inexplicable sense of peace and musical inspiration while walking among the restored graves. If you ever visit Hannah's cemetery in Macon County, North Carolina, remember that it represents the power of music to transform even the most violent spirits into something peaceful and redemptive. Hannah's century-long vigil proves that love and beauty can ultimately triumph over hatred and violence, even when the battle takes place in realms that exist beyond normal human perception. Story 10. Turkey Bride. The gobbling started the night my wife found the text on my phone, and I knew the turkey bride had come for me. It echoed through the West Virginia hills like some demented battle cry, a sound that was part bird and part woman screaming in rage. My neighbors in Coal Grove had warned me about the legend when I moved here 6 months ago, but I thought it was just mountain folklore designed to scare city folks. Now I understood that some stories are warnings dressed up as entertainment. My name is Frank Coleman, and I am a telecommunications engineer from Pittsburgh who made the mistake of thinking rural living would solve my marriage problems. When Sarah and I started having trouble, I convinced her that a fresh start in the mountains would give us the space we needed to reconnect. I bought a house on 15 acres outside Coal Grove, a tiny community where everybody knows everybody and secrets are impossible to keep. The locals told me about Martha Hensley within a week of our arrival. She had lived in these hills back in the 1890s, married to a man named Jeremiah who spent more time drinking and gambling than working his small farm. Martha suspected her husband was unfaithful, but she could never prove it until she discovered an old book of Cherokee magic that promised to give her the power to see what others tried to hide. According to the legend, Martha practiced dark rituals in the woods behind her cabin, learning to transform herself into various animals so she could spy on the people of Coal Grove without being detected. Her favorite form was a wild turkey, large enough to travel long distances but common enough to avoid suspicion as she wandered through the settlement gathering secrets. Martha used her transformed state to follow her husband on his evening trips to town, watching from the shadows as he met with other women and spent their meager savings on whiskey and card games. But the magic came with a price that she did not understand until it was too late. Each transformation made it harder to change back, and the animal instincts began overwhelming her human consciousness. The locals say Martha was stuck in turkey form for 3 days before she finally managed to resume human shape, and by then something fundamental had changed in her mind. She had absorbed too much of the turkey's nature, developing an obsession with territorial behavior and an uncontrollable rage toward anything that threatened her claim on her husband. Jeremiah Hensley shot his wife on a cold November morning in 1894, mistaking her turkey form for wild game as she stalked through the woods near their cabin. He field-dressed the bird and brought it home for dinner, never suspecting he had killed his own spouse until neighbors noticed Martha had been missing for several days. The truth came out when Jeremiah tried to prepare the turkey for cooking and found human hair mixed with the feathers, human teeth embedded in the beak, human fingers fused to the wing bones. He realized with growing horror that his wife had been trapped mid-transformation when his shotgun blast ended her life, leaving her suspended between human and animal forms. Jeremiah buried the remains behind the cabin and never spoke of what he had discovered, but Martha, his spirit was not finished with him or with the community that had harbored his infidelities. Within weeks of her death, people reported hearing gobbling sounds in the woods at night, along with a woman whose voice cursing unfaithful husbands in language that would make a sailor blush. The turkey bride began appearing to men who cheated on their wives, stalking them through the mountains in her horrific hybrid form. Those who saw her described a creature that was neither fully human nor fully bird, with bronze feathers covering pale skin and a face that shifted between woman and turkey depending on the angle of view. Her gobbling carried the rhythm of human speech, delivering curses and threats to men whose marriages were built on lies. I laughed when old Pete Morrison told me this story over coffee at the general store, dismissing it as typical Appalachian folklore designed to keep husbands faithful through supernatural fear. Sarah and I were having problems, but nothing that couldn't be worked out with time and effort. The mountain air and slower pace of rural life would help us remember why we had fallen in love in the first place. But the isolation had the opposite effect on our relationship. Sarah felt trapped without her city job and social circle, while I threw myself into consulting work that kept me traveling and away from home for days at a time. The space between us grew wider instead of smaller, filled with unspoken resentments and the kind of silence that precedes either reconciliation or divorce. That was when I started the affair with Rebecca Walsh, a real estate agent from the county seat who helped me find our property. What began as friendly conversations about rural living evolved into something more complicated when Sarah and I went through a particularly rough patch in September. Rebecca understood the challenges of mountain life in ways my wife never would, and she provided the emotional connection that had been missing from my marriage. I told myself it was just friendship, then just emotional support, then just physical comfort that did not really count because it happened outside the bounds of my normal life. The affair felt separate from my marriage, like something that existed in a parallel dimension where consequences did not apply to ordinary moral rules. But secrets are impossible to keep in small communities, especially when those secrets involve two people who have to maintain professional relationships with the same network of neighbors and business contacts. Sarah started noticing changes in my behavior, asking questions about my extended business trips and unexpected delays returning home from routine appointments. The confrontation came on a Thursday night in October, when Sarah found my phone and discovered 6 months of text messages that revealed the true nature of my relationship with Rebecca. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, destroying any possibility of explanation or rationalization that might have salvaged our marriage. Sarah packed a bag and drove back to Pittsburgh that same night, leaving me alone in the mountain house with nothing but silence and the weight of choices that could not be undone. I expected anger, tears, demands for divorce proceedings. What I did not expect was the sound that began echoing through the hills the moment her taillights disappeared around the bend. Gobbling. Deep. Resonant. Unmistakably territorial. At first I thought it was coincidence. Just wild turkeys roosting in the woods behind my house. But the sound continued throughout the night, moving in circles around my property like something conducting surveillance. Every time I looked out the windows, I saw nothing but darkness and the shadows of trees swaying in the autumn wind. The gobbling grew louder over the following days, accompanied by sounds that were harder to identify. Scratching at my doors and windows, heavy footsteps on the front porch, wings flapping against the siding like something trying to break through the walls. My security cameras captured nothing but static and shadows, but the sounds continued regardless of whether I was watching or not. Rebecca stopped returning my calls after the first week, claiming she had reconciled with her estranged husband and could no longer maintain any contact with married men. The timing seemed suspicious, especially when I learned she had left town suddenly and put her house on the market without explanation. Something had scared her badly enough to abandon her established life and flee to another state. That was when I began seeing the turkey bride myself. She appeared first in my peripheral vision, a large shape moving through the trees at the edge of my property. When I turned to look directly, she would vanish, leaving only disturbed leaves and scratches in the bark of nearby trees. But gradually she grew bolder, allowing me glimpses of her true form as she stalked through my nightmares and my waking hours with equal persistence. The creature was exactly as the legends described, a horrific fusion of human and turkey characteristics that violated every natural law. Her body was covered in bronze feathers that shifted and rippled like living metal, revealing patches of pale skin underneath that looked diseased and mottled. Her face was the worst part, constantly changing between human features and turkey characteristics depending on her emotional state. When she was calm, she almost looked like a normal woman with unusual hair coloring. But when her rage peaked, her nose would elongate into a beak. Her eyes would become small and bright like a bird's, and her mouth would open to reveal both human teeth and the hard edges of a turkey's bill. The gobbling sounds she made carried the rhythm of human speech, curses and threats delivered in a voice that was neither fully animal nor human. She began appearing closer to my house, standing at the edge of my yard in full view during daylight hours. Her message was clear without words. She had come to punish my infidelity, to make me pay for the betrayal that had destroyed my marriage and driven my wife away from her mountain home. But the turkey bride was not content with simple revenge. She wanted me to experience the same transformation that had claimed Martha Hensley over a century ago, to trap me between human and animal forms as punishment for my failure to honor the commitment I had made to my wife. The changes started with my voice, developing a harsh quality that made normal conversation difficult. My throat began producing involuntary clicking sounds, especially when I was stressed or angry. My skin grew rough and bumpy, developing patches that itched constantly and could not be soothed by any medicine or lotion. Most disturbing were the changes in my behavior and instincts. I found myself becoming obsessively territorial about my property, reacting with disproportionate anger to any perceived intrusion. My diet changed toward raw vegetables and grains, while meat became increasingly difficult to digest. I began sleeping in different locations each night, following patterns that made no rational sense but felt absolutely necessary for my survival. The turkey bride watched my transformation with satisfaction, appearing more frequently as the changes accelerated. She had not come to kill me or drive me away. She had come to recruit me, to add another victim to her eternal hunt for unfaithful husbands who needed to be punished for their betrayals. I understood finally that Martha Hensley had not died in 1894. She had been transformed into something that existed between life and death, between human and animal, between justice and revenge. The turkey bride was not a ghost but a cursed being who had taken on the role of supernatural enforcer, ensuring that men who broke their marriage vows faced consequences that went far beyond divorce courts and financial settlements. My transformation completed itself on Halloween night, exactly 1 month after Sarah discovered my affair. I felt my bones reshaping themselves, my fingers fusing together into wing-like appendages, my face elongating into something that could no longer pass for fully human. But unlike Martha Hensley, I retained enough consciousness to understand what was happening to me. I had become the turkey bride, its apprentice, another hybrid creature condemned to hunt unfaithful husbands throughout the Appalachian Mountains. We work in partnership now, stalking men who believe their secrets are safe in small communities where everyone minds their own business. The mountains are full of such men, and we have eternity to find them all. The gobbling you hear in the West Virginia hills is not the sound of wild turkeys calling to each other. It is the sound of supernatural justice being delivered to men who thought they could escape the consequences of their choices by hiding in rural communities where their wives would never discover the truth. If you are listening to this story and you have been unfaithful to your spouse, remember that secrets cannot stay buried forever in places where the dead refuse to rest. The turkey bride knows about your betrayals, and she is already planning your punishment. The transformation is not quick, and it is not merciful, but it is permanent, and it comes with the absolute certainty that your suffering will help prevent other marriages from being destroyed by lies and infidelity. Sarah never came back to Coal Grove, and I no longer expect her to. She was smart to leave when she discovered my betrayal, saving herself from witnessing what I had become. My house stands empty now, waiting for the next unfaithful husband who thinks mountain isolation will protect him from the consequences of his actions. The turkey bride and I continue our hunt, following the scent of broken promises and betrayed trust through communities that pride themselves on traditional values and family loyalty. We are the supernatural enforcement mechanism that ensures those values are more than just empty words. The gobbling echoes through the mountains tonight, calling out to men who know they deserve what is coming for them. The fire burns low, and our Appalachian stories fade into the night, but the silence after feels heavier, doesn't it? Thanks for sharing this time with me. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you're here when the next whisper drifts down from the ridge. In the comments, tell me your hometown or the creepiest story your family ever told. Until then, walk carefully. In these mountains, the night walks too.